Sega, you didn't fuck it up. I know, it's okay, round of applause, they did it. So I finally beat Sonic Frontiers, and I know I'm a little late to the party on this one, but I wanted my first playthrough to be as thorough as possible so I could form an opinion I stand behind. I will say immediately that many of my fears going into this game were answered right away. In the opening hour, Sonic Frontiers introduces its mechanics to the player, sometimes in a rather intrusive way, and while it can be a little much at first, it throws you into the world and pretty much tells you to just go. And it's this design that I've been harping for the Sonic series to adopt for years now. It just fits so seamlessly with the style and philosophy behind the character that it seemed like a match made in heaven. And I'm happy to say that my hopes were validated, for the most part. Sonic in an open world is just fun and satisfying to play. And hell, Sega even learned that keeping jump and the homing attack to separate buttons is just the logical thing to do. Bonus points for finally doing something that everyone has always asked for. But putting everything gameplay aside for a minute, I mentioned in my last video that the one thing I wanted this game to really nail was Sonic's movement. I won't go off on another tangent, but previous 3D Sonic games typically came with a level of stiffness in the controls that really prevented me from loving my experience with them. And by comparison, this game really offers exactly what I was looking for. Sonic is responsive to player inputs, and even when you crank up the speed settings to the maximum value, it still feels like you have a high level of control in the most ridiculously fast sequences. It's important to note that if you're playing this game on console, it's very important to keep the game on performance mode to keep those frames high and that frustration low though. The game really benefits from that consistent 60 FPS, so do yourself a favor. You're welcome. But even with me loving how this game plays and the satisfaction I get from running Sonic around these big maps and grinding on every rail I see floating out in space, I have to acknowledge that the game is still flawed. The level up system becomes more redundant as the game wears on, and you realize that even on the hard difficulty, it just really isn't all that hard in the first place. On top of that, the way you level up your ring count and speed is extremely tedious, with you having to manually click the button multiple times to level up one level at a time. This one is especially frustrating because you can level up power and defense multiple levels with one click of a button, so the tediousness is just amplified. One of the major criticisms from people who got to play this early is the pop-in of obstacles when you're running around the map and suddenly realize you ran into a pillar you couldn't see before. If you aren't sure what I'm referring to, pop-in basically means that the player can't see structures in the game they should be able to see when they should be able to see them, and thus, they can't react accordingly.
Those sure are words you said just now.
I've seen people across the internet advocate that an animation placed over top the pop-in would reduce its jarring look, but in my opinion that would put even more of a tax on console hardware than actually solve the problem. Not to mention, it'd be distracting as all hell. To me, and this is coming from someone who's not a game developer, I believe the pop-in in Sonic Frontiers is a direct result of how fast the player is able to traverse the large maps. To me, the pop-in wasn't game-breaking or a detractor for my overall experience, but I can understand the frustration and where people are coming from on this. But with that out of the way, the other major complaint I saw from people about the game were the cyberspace levels being a little on the less quality side, let's say. I personally like the cyberspace stages more than I thought, but they certainly vary wildly in fun factor. The good news about them is that they are all relatively short and each have a distinguishing gimmick or design philosophy, but they could have benefited from having more themes between them. Rather than designing them as classic bowling lane 3D Sonic levels players are accustomed to, I would have rather seen the cyberspace stages designed in a format that was more similar to the Sonic Adventure series with more objectives and freedom in the levels. Regardless, I don't think they were as bad as people made them seem. To me, the Supersonic boss fights were much more of a letdown and really are the only sections of the game where I felt completely out of control of Sonic's movement. Overall, Sonic Frontiers was certainly an ambitious reimagining of the Sonic formula, and I can say that I really enjoyed my experience with the game. Its tone and story were enjoyable for a longtime fan, and despite the valid criticisms people have for the game, this is the first time I felt excited for the future of the franchise in a long time. Quite a diversion from the typical gameplay for the franchise. The collect tokens, keys, coins, however you want to master the mechanics to beat the game format all seems like it's leading up to a more traditional entry in the series in this new formula, and I really hope that turns out to be the case. Sonic Frontiers may have been more of the Legends Arceus of the series than the Breath of the Wild, but hey, the good news is I enjoyed Legends Arceus too. Now, there's one last thing I wanted to mention about the game that I just can't stay silent about. Sega, you can throw me as many open world Sonic games with surprisingly good fishing minigames as you want, but no amount of reeling in alligators and item boxes will soothe this revelation that they will all be
horrible wastes of human mental capacity
until you bring me the Chow Garden. That's it. That should have been the only thing I said in this video. Bad game. See you next time.